Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Oregon Association of Realtors welcomes you to our Zoom meeting, our Zoom webinar, how to host a great Zoom meeting. Tip number one, make sure you mute yourself when you are letting people join if you weren't ready to start talking. Thanks everybody who let us know that we weren't muted. All right, so this webinar is being presented in Zoom. And if you are wanting to ask presenters questions, use the chat to send to all presenters. For support, you can email info@oregonrealtors.com or call our office. Please note that this webinar is not offered for CE credit. It is simply for your own edification. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Erica Curry, and I want to welcome you. I am the new Education Director here at OAR. A few fun facts about me. I love to travel. In one calendar year, I managed to make it to 3 continents and 9 countries. And it was a very fun year for me, and I have not traveled that much since, but I try to take at least one big trip a year. Another fun fact is I am a diehard Beavers fan. I got my undergraduate and my master's there. And I'm coming from a higher ed background, so go Beavs. I'm also brand new to OAR. This week actually marks my first week full-time. I started with OAR about 3 weeks ago part-time, and now I'm here full-time. So thank you so much for joining us. The reason I'm giving this webinar today is because, first of all, I've had about 2 years of experience using Zoom at least weekly to host meetings and webinars. I also have done training for faculty in higher education, as well as training in other job spaces. I also recently gave a webinar, and some of this content is coming from that webinar for the organization that I used to run called Oregon Women in Higher Education. All right, so today's agenda are the keys, and the keys to success, I couldn't help that pun, we're gonna do a quick demo on how to schedule a meeting. We're gonna do another demo on some settings to know within your meeting. And then we're going to talk through some just best practices, including preparing for the meeting and facilitating the meeting. So to get started, I'd like to do a little bit to see who's in the room, and I'm going to launch a poll. All right, and you'll have about 2 minutes to respond to this poll. All right, so it looks like about 73% of us have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and end the polling now. And I will share these results. So you'll see before the time of social distancing, most folks had not used Zoom very regularly. And yet now we have 64% of the people in this meeting have to use Zoom weekly. So there's been a big jump in the use of Zoom, which is no surprise. We also have, and I like seeing that there's a little bit of diversity and experience here, but we have the majority of people have hosted never, and then followed closely by once or twice. We only have 2 people who have hosted more than twice on Zoom. So that's good for me to know in terms of what I'm going to be explaining. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing these results and move on to our next slide. All right, so now I'm going to show you a quick demo on how to schedule a meeting. And to do that, I'm going to go, you can follow along. We're going to post a link right now to a resource guide. And I'm going to figure out how to do that in a webinar really quickly. There it is. All right. Here you are. Here's the link to a resource guide that'll walk through much of what we talk about today, and it will also include links to Zoom's official guides and some other links that I thought were helpful. So feel free to follow along if you'd like. I'm going to walk through each of these steps, but this guide goes through them in much more depth and talks about all the different decisions. I know for me it's helpful to see someone do it, but also helpful to have a reference guide. So feel free to take a look at the resource guide, but if that's going to be distracting to you, just know that it's there. All right. Thank you, everyone. Here's the link. I'll be honest, I don't do webinars nearly as often as I do meetings. So there's a few changes in the settings that we're going to have to talk about as we go through this. Some of the things that I'm going to show you in this demo are not going to be the same as what you see when we are doing when you do a meeting. All right, so now I'm going to change my screen share and we're going to go here. All right, so now we're going to open up Zoom. And we're going to schedule a meeting. So the first step will always be to sign in. And you can sign in, you can create a free account in Zoom, or you can create a paid account. There's a few differences. Zoom can really walk through all those. There's a few documents that'll walk through all those differences that you can find in the links that I shared. However, we will be going more in depth on licensing and security features in our next Zoom meeting, or in our next webinar in this series. So we're going to click, so I've gone to my account, and now I'm going to schedule a meeting, which is this button up here. And now we're going to walk through these settings. So I would title my meeting. You can give it a description, and anyone who registers can see this description. You set the time, the date and the time that you want the meeting to launch. Remember, the meeting won't launch without you. You still have to put it in there. And then we've got a duration. So you can have it for an hour, or you can have it for however long you'd like. But please keep in mind that setting the duration only allows you to have it on the calendar that way. It does not impact how long the actual meeting lasts. You can also set it, and you can change time zones as well if that's useful. You can set recurring meetings. So if I wanted to have a webinar every Tuesday for 7 weeks, I could do so, or so here's every day. You could change it to weekly. What this does is if you have a recurring meeting where you want everyone to just have the same link each time, this works really well for that. And so that's those settings. You can also turn on require registration. This is great if you're trying to track who's coming to the meeting in advance. We turned on require registration for this so that I knew that we had 23 people attending. You can turn on meeting password, which means every attendee has to put in a password. One thing that I do is instead of requiring a meeting password, I turn on the waiting room feature. So this is where people join and then I choose whether I want to let them in the room or not. And this helps with just an extra layer of security. It helps me control the flow of the room, but it also can be a bit distracting. And so I can do this really easily because I've got Katie here helping me let people into the room. If I don't set this enable waiting room, then anyone can just join the meeting at any time. If I set require password, then they would still need a password. So my preferred settings is to not require a password, but enable the waiting room. So one of the defaults in Zoom is that when you start a meeting, the video for everyone is off. I like to turn it on because especially if I'm hosting a meeting, I want people in the room with me. And so I want people to opt out of video instead of opting in. I always leave the audio settings to both telephone and computer audio because sometimes folks don't have a microphone on their computer or they don't have great speakers on their computer and they can do better on their telephone. If somebody's working from a laptop, if they are joined through computer audio, every time they type, everyone in the room can hear them. So sometimes it's easier for folks to join by cell phone that way, so that I can't hear the typing. A few more settings: enable join before host, lets people come into the meeting room before the meeting has started. And this is just helpful so that if you're running a minute late, it's not as big of a deal. Mute participants upon entry. I like this setting when we have a big group of people that we're getting together. If it's a smaller meeting and engagements the big goal of the meeting, then I don't necessarily turn that on. One setting that can be confusing is only authenticated users can join. For this setting, I don't ever turn it on because it would require that anyone who joined had a Zoom account. And I can't control whether or not everyone has used Zoom, so I don't turn that setting on. You can also choose to breakout room pre-assign if you've paid for one of the upgraded Zoom licenses. So if I wanted to put people into breakout rooms, I can pre-create the rooms and say I want 3 breakout rooms, and right now I don't have any attendees invited, so I can't assign anyone to the room. But if I had people registered or invited, I could assign them right here. And then the other setting is if you plan on having a recorded meeting, this is really helpful. And you can say you want it recorded on the local computer or in the cloud. If I forget, this is helpful for me because I don't always remember to hit the record button right away. And so this setting is really helpful for me. You can also set an alternative host, but that person has to be someone who's in your organization. What's the purpose of breakout rooms? That's a great question. The purpose of breakout rooms is to take everyone from, so right now, you are all in one big webinar. You can't, because it's a webinar, you can't speak to each other. If it were a meeting, we would all have tiles across the screen and could be talking interchangeably. When you're in whichever method you're using, webinar or meeting, you can take people and put them in breakout rooms so they're in smaller groups. So they would be in a meeting room themselves. And if I wanted to just put 4 people in a group to talk about something, I can do that. And then when they leave the breakout room, they come back to the main meeting space. So imagine it like if you're at a conference, you're creating little spaces for people to go and break out and do their conversation. And then when they leave, they come back into the large group again. And then the number one thing is when you are done, hit save. This is really helpful. If you don't hit save, the meeting won't exist. So don't ever forget to hit save. From here, you've got a few more settings. You can see who's registered. You can here click edit, and you can add registration questions. So if you wanted to know where people are coming from, if you wanted to know folks' NERDS number, you can create questions here. So you can add custom questions and create a new question and add that to registration. There's also a list of predefined questions that you can choose from and choose to require. If you have the upgraded version, there's also something called polls, which is where you saw the poll that we did earlier. This is where I created it. Polls and breakout rooms are helpful to think about in advance and create in advance, because these are really hard to make on the fly in the actual meeting. All right, so those are the settings for a Zoom meeting. And so that is how you schedule a meeting, and those are some of the settings that you can set within the meeting. All right, and I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen again and move on to, and so those are the settings to know. There are more settings that you can do within your meeting space, but because I'm currently hosting a Zoom meeting, I can't share those. But those are all in the links in the guide that I gave you. All right, so we're gonna go back to our presentation now. All right, so let's talk about preparing for the meeting. Before I move on, I want us to pause. Are there any questions? All right. So the number of signings based on the level of account you pay for. I don't believe so. It might be the number of breakout rooms you can create change, but looking at it, if you have the Zoom meetings account, then it doesn't look like there's any restrictions on how many people can be in there. Yep, thank you, Katie. I see Katie answered that already. She's so great. All right. So let's talk about preparing for the meeting. We're going to talk about audio, internet, presenting yourself, creating a visually appealing presentation, access to materials, and co-presenting. All right, let's talk about clear audio. So headphones help minimize background noise, especially if you're doing your meeting from home. Having headphones with the microphone can really help make sure that you're not picking up all the background noise, like the puppies barking or the garbage truck coming by or the ambulance driving by. However, you want to double check that. My mom uses AirPods and I can never hear a word she's saying because the audio is just so garbled. So you always want to double check that your headphones and mic are coming through clearly. One of my big tips, and everyone got a good lesson in that this morning, is always mute when you're not speaking or presenting. One of my favorite tricks in Zoom is that you can unmute yourself. If you have yourself set it to mute, if you press and hold the space bar, then you temporarily unmute yourself. And it's like a push to talk sort of thing. So as long as I'm holding the space bar, everyone can hear me. I put this next bullet up early to remind myself to speak slower than usual. When you're speaking in a webinar and you're not reading people's faces, it can be really tempting to speak quicker than usual. If you're working with other people, there's a great tip. If you have other people unmuted, which because this is a webinar, we don't, if you pause for 7 seconds, that gives space for other people to jump in and ask questions. And one thing that we really recommend doing is requesting people to raise their hand if they have a question. No, I can't see anybody's face in this webinar. So feel free to make as many funny faces as you want. I can't see your face. Good question, Barb. Thank you. And then the next tip is test your audio and microphone. Katie and I did that before the start of the webinar and made sure that you could hear me clearly, I wasn't too loud, and that I had a nice background behind me. One of the backups that I recommend is, there's 2 backups. So if you're having any problems with your camera, your computer updated last night, now you're trying to host a meeting and you just can't get your webcam to work, or you just can't get your audio to work, is to call in. So one of those features I showed you is you can allow both telephone and computer audio. Being able to call in on Zoom is really nice because now you've got the audio on your phone. You can also, if it really is necessary, use chat instead of talking. I mean, obviously that is not the ideal, but if you have attendees who can't seem to get audio going, they can always use the chat as well. Our next tip is strong internet. And these are just some helpful tips for you in thinking about how to make sure your internet is as strong as possible. The number one thing we recommend is a wired connection if possible. So that's what we're using today. We connected it to, we're using Ethernet instead of Wi-Fi. If you have a little modem, like a cable box type thing where your internet comes out of, and you have one of these cords shown in the picture, you can usually plug directly from there into your laptop or into your computer. Sometimes you need what are called dongles or adapters to let you do that, but you should be able to connect your internet directly to your computer. Another helpful tip that I learned recently is to close high bandwidth applications like Google Drive, which I did not do for the purposes of this meeting because we're using Google Drive. Slack, which is an instant messaging system. I closed Outlook so that that's not coming through because it can be really distracting when everyone hears the ding from your inbox. And then turn off your video if you're having issues with freezing. If you're not showing up or you're cutting out or you're making funny faces and freezing, turn off your video. That'll help your audio come through a lot clearer, stronger, and more consistently. And again, as a backup, you can always call in. Sometimes your internet just decides to not be great, but maybe you still have really good signal. So then you can use your phone. And at least you're then divvying up the load on your internet. All right, our next one is presenting yourself. So one of the big steps is it's hard to create connection in a virtual space. And so making sure that you start off the meeting being welcoming and engaging. I started by giving you fun facts about myself. Have a simple but professional background. One of the things people do a lot right now is set virtual backgrounds, which can be really fun, especially if you're in a small meeting. But if you're ever presenting, I don't actually recommend a virtual background if you can avoid it, because it can be really distracting to the attendees. Because when you move, things in your background, like the lamp overhead, come in and out of your virtual background, and it can be kind of distracting. Or maybe that's just me. Make sure you have lighting from the front. If you're backlit, your face will be in shadow. And so if you have lighting from the front and a window from the front or anything like that, that'll really help you. If you do have windows behind you or to the side of you, I recommend closing the blinds, because that'll just help make sure that the lighting is coming straight on. Test your video in advance and make sure that that works. If it doesn't work, there are a few options. You can look at your video settings. If everyone takes a moment, well, no, you're in a webinar, so you can't. When you're in a meeting, you could actually take and where you see start stop video, there's a little up chevron that you can click on, and then you can change your video settings, and you can also upload a photo of yourself. So then, even if they can't see you talking in real time, they can at least see a photo of you, and you're not just your initials in a meeting. And also you can embed a picture of yourself in the slides. All right, there was a question on any solution yet for Mac users on virtual backgrounds. Not that I've heard of, but I'm sure, but Katie can look into it and see if Zoom's published anything recently. All right, so to create a visually appealing slide deck. In the resource guide, you'll see I have links to this down at the bottom, and I have links to some great PowerPoint templates. If you're not using branded PowerPoints, you can find some really fun and engaging ones and some just really visually appealing ones that you can use. In terms of accessibility, I've also included some links to a colorblind screen tester, so that you can recognize places where your slide deck might not be inclusive for people who are colorblind, and your words aren't showing up to part of your audience. And there's also a screen reader tester in there, and some guides for creating screen reader accessible documentation. I've linked to some resources for free stock photos, which I like to use in my webinars to help break up, because when you have a lot of text, then people are reading and they're not necessarily listening. And photos help people get the concept, and it sticks better when they're not just reading it. So pictures are a great tool, and I've linked to some of my favorites for free open use stock images. And then finally, I wanted to just make a note about data. If anyone's trying to present data in a meeting, there's a link there to the DataViz catalog, which is really helpful if you are one of my favorite features is it says, like, what do you want to show through the data? So I want to show change over time. Okay, here's some different graph options you can use. I want to show movement in and out of something. Okay, here's some graph options you can use. And it helps you pick which data viz is best for telling your data story. And then you click on it, it gives you a description of that type of data viz. And then you can see in the bottom, they've got links to different places that you can make them. So if anybody's interested, that's one of my favorite resources. The next one to talk about is access to materials. So one of the big things is to consider if you want participants to follow along or reference later. I gave you all the option to do either. Sometimes though, if you don't want folks distracted, having people reference later is more helpful. So you'd want to share the information later. If you want people to be able to follow along like I do, then you can share it right up in advance. Some possible materials to share would be the slide deck, the resource handout, a worksheet if you want people to work through something, or a recording of the webinar. So, and then there's a couple different possible ways to share the resources. You can do link sharing through Dropbox, Drive, or Google Drive, or Box. You can upload it within the presentation. You can send an in-the-moment link like I did. Well, I did an in-the-moment link to a shared Dropbox. But you can also consider, if you're trying to get a lot of information to people, I highly recommend considering multiple methods. One great tool is to just put the link into the meeting invite in the very beginning. Okay, so Next up, I want to talk about presenting with others. Sometimes you're the only host of the meeting, and other times you're discussing technology and sharing tips. Other times you're presenting with other people. One of the big things to do when you start is to discuss the technology and share any tips that you have in advance. Make sure the person you're co-presenting with has a web camera and a microphone. Let them know about the pause, the space bar to speak option. And make sure that you just kind of talk through all that before you get started. When you're timing out your webinar, plan extra time for transitions between speakers. I'd love to believe that I could seamlessly just pass it off to the next person without a problem, but often they need to get themselves going. They forget to unmute, or you forget to mute yourself, or they're having a hard time sharing the screen. So just give yourself an extra 2 minutes for that transition space. The other tip that I'm going to strongly recommend is only having one slide deck. It can be a lot when you're trying to shift between slide decks. And so having one slide deck, and if you need like a collaborative place to build it, I recommend using Google Slides. Google Slides is just, as Google Doc is to Word, Google Slides is to PowerPoint. It has most of the same functionality. A lot of it looks the same, and you can upload a PowerPoint directly into Google Slides and it will update it all for you. And but it's a place where everyone can be working on the PowerPoint at the same time. The next thing I'm going to recommend, and you'll see this is a recurring theme, is schedule a test run. The best way to get comfortable hosting a meeting in Zoom is to practice and practice, practice, practice. So make sure you schedule a test run with your other presenters. You're going to be testing, does your audio work? Does your webcam work? Does your how smooth are your transitions between each other? And how are you doing managing the slides? Speaking of managing the slides, you want to also clarify what people's roles are in the webinar. So in this webinar, I'm the presenter. Katie is my facilitator. She's helping field questions. She's monitoring the chat for me. She's tech support for things. She's also monitoring the waiting room to make sure people are coming in and out. And I'm the one screen sharing, and I'm the one managing the slide progression. But you just want to talk through all of these different steps. Who's taking care of these in your meeting before you get started? All right, so that was preparing for the meeting. I see that there's a question, so I'm going to jump to that. But if you have any other questions, now is a great time to submit them. All right. Do you recommend hosting a class as webinars or Zoom meetings? You can use breakout rooms, polls, and meetings. Great question, Barb. So Barb wants to know if we should be hosting classes as webinars or Zoom meetings. It depends on the purpose of your class. If you want to be able to engage the people, and how big your class is too. If you want to be able to engage people in a conversation, if you want to call on people to have them jump in with their input, if you want to be building kind of a sense of community by letting people see each other, a meeting is definitely the way to go. Cheryl, thank you. Yes, people do engage a lot more in a Zoom gallery. If we are using a webinar, it's a great way to get a lot of information to people, but I can't read the room right now to see if people are nodding along or anything like that. So I could put everyone in breakout rooms, which would build a little bit of community, but only for that brief moment of time. And for classrooms where you want to be checking, are people actually watching, and are people, making breakfast while they're on the Zoom call, you would want to go for a meeting. So it depends on what your purpose is, but for the most part, I would recommend meetings over classroom or over webinars. Okay, so next we're going to move on to facilitating meetings. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to pepper them out. All right. So, and also I have a firm belief that when you're instant messaging in this sort of space, typos don't count, because you're trying to get that point in really quickly. So I give a lot of typo grace in this space. All right. Facilitating meetings. We're going to talk about these 8 different items. So let's get started. First, prepare. Know how you plan on engaging people in advance. So some of the things you want to make sure you think about way before is the Zoom settings. Am I using breakout rooms? And if so, how many do I think I'm going to need? You can always add more right before the start of the meeting, so that's not too big of a deal. And then polls. As I mentioned before, I have to write the poll before I launch the meeting, so make sure you know what you're going to be asking when you get started. There's other external tools that you can be using for engagement, things like digital whiteboards. And if you Google digital whiteboards, you'll find a whole slew of different tools. I like to use even like Google Docs to give people space to work collaboratively. If I wanted to do a brainstorming meeting, I might use Google Docs. There's also a whiteboard feature in Zoom, so I can draw a star. Well, I can pretend to draw a star. I didn't do well in high school art classes. So you can do that. If I wanted to like highlight a point, I can do that really quickly. And then if I was like, oops, let me change how I drew that. Zoom, all right. So you can use the digital whiteboard setting here in Zoom as well. So then the other thing to keep in mind as you're preparing is presentation outline. So make sure you're building in places to pause for reflection time. One of the things I like to do is use scaffolded slides so you can follow along and see where we are in the meeting, and also use that as a time for people to pause and ask any questions that they have. If you're building in discussion into your meeting, then always show the discussion question on the slide. Because this is a webinar, this isn't as interactive and engaging as I would normally host something, so keep that in mind. But anytime you have discussion, it's great to have, like, even if it's an introduction, like you want people to say their name, where they're from, and how many years of experience they have. Put those on the slide so that people can just quickly reference that as they're speaking, and they're not distracted trying to remember the list as we're going around and introducing everybody else. It also helps the flow of things. And quick tip, if you're doing introductions in a Zoom meeting, assign it so that whoever speaks gets to call on the next person. This helps people pay attention because now they're on the hook to know who spoke who's already spoken and who hasn't. And it also spares you from the awkward moment of who's I'll go. Nobody wants that moment in a meeting if we can avoid it. So by assigning someone to call on the next person, that'll make your introductions run a lot smoother. If you're trying to teach people something, I really recommend creating pause for reflection time, because when people have a chance to examine their own assumptions about something and then you present information, that helps that information stick a little bit better. All right. So, I have to erase all of my annotations really quickly. Clear all drawings. Perfect. And now that's done. All right. The next step is to set engaging expectations. So you saw I did this on the starting slide. Do we want questions throughout or only at the start? How do we want people to ask questions? Do you want everyone to have their video on? And then also showing the agenda. Setting that up in the beginning helps people know what's expected of them in the meeting, and it helps them engage better. And it helps for a more seamless engagement process for you. Block appropriate prep time. So when you're hosting a webinar, give yourself 15 minutes. If you're hosting by yourself, a webinar or a meeting, give yourself 15 minutes to get into Zoom, make sure your webcam and your microphone are working, make sure that everything is loaded up properly, things are displaying right. And 15 minutes should be enough time to test it and then troubleshoot anything that's not right and be ready to welcome your guests. If you're in a group, I highly recommend getting together 30 minutes in advance, and for a couple of reasons. One, not everybody runs on the same time schedule as you. So for me, if you're one of those people where 5 minutes early is late, then make sure you're booking people way 30 minutes in advance to get together. It also helps you make sure that everyone knows their roles. This is a great time to talk about who's introducing, who's fielding questions, who's monitoring the chat, and who's doing the slide transition. Hopefully you've covered that before in your practice round, but if you haven't, that 30 minutes is also great for that. It also gives people a time to remember, like, oh, I need to go to the restroom. I need to grab coffee. If you give yourself 30 minutes, it's a lot less stressful. And then I also recommend opening the meeting 5 minutes early and remembering to mute. All right, my next tip is have a water or a beverage handy. When you're speaking a lot, you can get voice fry, or during the time of COVID, anytime you cough, it's really distracting. And so for me, having water helps with allergies, and it just helps. It's a good way to take care of yourself and also make sure that your coughing isn't distracting and your voice doesn't get too tired. Reading the room online is really hard. If you are an extrovert who gets energy from other people, people seem to forget that their face is on camera in Zoom. And so they will sit and just be looking at you, or, looking off in the corner. And it's hard for you to read the room and see, are people actually engaged? So as an audience member, one of my things is I try to be excessively expressive, which is my default state anyway. But by adding smiles, it helps the presenter stay energized and engaged, and lets them know that their meeting is coming across. However, one of the things with reading the room, you can, when you are doing a meeting, you can set it up so you've got gallery view, so you're seeing a lot of people. Even if you are doing a screen share, if you have dual monitors, you can have your entire gallery on one monitor and then your presentation on the other, so you can still see people. One of the other things with reading the room is hard is this means Zoom meetings can be a little bit more tiring than your standard presentation, because you're constantly second guessing how you're coming across to your audience. This is one of the reasons I recommend not having more than 2 to 3 hours in a Zoom meeting, because you're going to be really tired. So reading the room is very hard in a meeting. Building in space for people to engage, have discussion, asking people to nod if you're getting this. Those are all great ways to get people to give you feedback and to help you read that room a little bit better. Hide self feature. If you're somebody who is distracted by your own video, or either in a good way or in a less positive way, there is a feature in Zoom. All you have to do is Google hide self feature Zoom, and you can actually hide your own video in your Zoom meeting so that you're not distracted looking at yourself. All right, so I've said this and I'm going to say it one more time. Practice, practice, practice. Using the tools and the video and the webinar system. I practice walking through all of the Zoom settings. I've practiced sharing my screen and turning the screen share off and coming back. The more you can practice, the better. If you can practice chat even. And one of the only ways to get really comfortable using Zoom and hosting meetings in Zoom is to just do it. So, do you have some friends that you'd love to have a happy hour with? Invite them to a Zoom meeting. Are you getting ready to call somebody for a meeting? See if they can do it in Zoom instead. Those low stress chances where even if you make a mistake, it's not a big deal, are great places to practice Zoom and start troubleshooting and getting more confident in using the system. It's just like riding a bike. Nobody's going to read the manual on how to ride a bike and be amazing at it at first. You have to get on and practice and practice and practice and fall down a few times to figure out how to balance yourself. That's all right. That's why you create low stakes ways to connect with people in Zoom to practice that. And so if anybody's planning on meeting with me, I encourage you to set up a Zoom meeting and host it. And if you're having any problems, I'm happy to troubleshoot with you. If something goes wrong, this is Peyto Lake in Alberta, in Alberta, Canada. It is in, what is that national park? Banff National Park. And it is one of my favorite places in the world. And so this is my happy place. When something goes wrong, I go back to my happy place. But don't panic. If you've walked into a meeting and spilled your coffee everywhere before, or knocked over a cup, or brought the wrong paperwork, you know how to respond to that in person. You stay calm, say, thanks everybody for your patience, and step out and take care of whatever you need to take care of and come back. I've been in a meeting where I put up the wrong presentation. We know how to handle that in real life. It's the same thing in Zoom. When something goes wrong, there's no need to panic. Just give yourself a couple of minutes to fix it. Like you saw I had a moment where I didn't know how to get to the chat. I just gave myself a second and figured it out, and it was okay. That's one of the things that I can't stress enough is people are going to give you a lot of patience in Zoom. And the calmer you are, the more people just don't know that anything's even going wrong. They might think you're just giving them some space for discussion. So you can just say, please take a moment to think about this concept while you figure out how to fix this problem in the back end. Take a deep breath. If you can't figure it out, Google is your best friend. Stop your screen share, Google how to fix it, and you'll be all right. So anytime something goes wrong, go back to your happy place. All right. So that is all of the things that I was going to share with you today. And now I want to open it back up to questions. And I see we've got a few. What is the difference between chat and Q&A? And Katie already answered. Chat is when a big group where you can make comments and questions collaboratively. Organized feature in Zoom. That's great. Thank you, Katie. All right. So do we have any other questions from our attendees? Has everyone had a chance to open the resource guide? Or if anyone hasn't opened the resource guide, I'd like you to take a minute to open it up and look through it and just click on a few links and see what you're working with. Feel free to download that and share it out. I find those are the links that I go to most often for Zoom help or getting ready to present a meeting or a webinar. All right, well, I'm going to open it up to one last poll. If anybody's got questions, feel free to, yeah, absolutely. Katie and I will email out that resource guide to all of the attendees after this meeting so that you have access to it that way as well. All right, polls and... All right, I'm going to launch the closing survey. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to submit them. Otherwise, take the survey and feel free to have a wonderful morning. Good question. We had a great question from the chat of when will the next segment be? I'm in the process of finalizing dates for the next two. I just really wanted to get this particular segment out as quickly as possible so that folks would have the opportunity to get more comfortable with Zoom as soon as possible. As soon as I have those dates nailed down, I will be sending out an email we'll be posting it in our Facebook, and we'll also be sending it to an all-member email. So stay tuned for the next segment, Zoom security and licensing. And the final segment in this is going to be creating a great customer experience virtually. And we'll be talking about listing or showing listings digitally and having great client meetings, both buyer and seller, remotely, and some ways to set that up for success. All right, we have another question, and thank you for this. So it's, how do you screen share? And when you are in a Zoom meeting, you will have, if you're full screen, it'll be up at the top. When you move your mouse up to the top, it'll drop down. If you are not full screen, it'll be at the bar at the bottom of your screen. There will be a green button that says share screen, and it's got a little box with an up arrow in it. You click on that box, and then you can choose, do I want to share just everything on my monitor? Do I want to share one specific window? So I had Spotify open on one Google tab, and then I had all of my stuff for this meeting in another Google tab. So I shared only the Google tab that had the presentation and the resource guide. If you are, you can share either. One of the things to know is if you only choose one, then when you switch tabs, other people can't see it. There's also, for anyone who wants to be super fancy, the ability to share music, which is how you all got to listen to Dancing Queen this morning to help everyone get in the right mood. Grace, does that answer your question? There's also a really good walkthrough guide. There's a really good walkthrough guide in Zoom. Here, let me open up how to host a great meeting. This Zoom guide link takes you to the Zoom Help Center, where there's a lot of really, like, you can find some great just basic tips. But we're gonna search share music. Well, I'm not gonna use Zoom search feature. I'm gonna go back to Google. So how do I share my music? It's right here. This is from the University of Minnesota, but here I will send that link. This is how you share music. And here is the Zoom help guide on how to share your screen. So this is a walkthrough video, and it also has a step-by-step guide. So there are 2 links for help on both of those. We'll give it about 2 more minutes for any additional questions, and then we're going to end the meeting if there aren't any. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you all here. I hope you have a wonderful morning, and we'll be here if you need anything. Thank you.